The galaxy had known peace for centuries. Peace, though fragile, maintained by the iron fist of the Aldrich Dominion. The Dominion's military might was unrivaled, its fleets dominating the vast stretches of space they controlled. Systems under their rule were either compliant or broken, their people resigned to lives of servitude. The galaxy's other species lived in fear, watching from the sidelines as the Aldrich moved from one conquest to another, always expanding, always securing their control. For years, there had been whispers of a distant species, uncharted in the Dominion's historical records, called humans. Legends said they were once a minor species from a small world on the edge of the known universe. The stories spoke of their resilience, their ability to adapt and overcome any obstacle, and of their mysterious disappearance from the galactic stage long ago. But those whispers faded into myth. The Dominion believed their rule was eternal, that no force in the universe could stand against them. Until the signal came. It was faint at first, barely detectable, a soft hum in the frequencies that most sensors ignored. But when it persisted, the Dominion's best scientists scrambled to investigate. They could not have predicted the implications of what they would uncover. The signal was not just a random anomaly. It was a beacon, a warning of something approaching. Something large, something powerful. At first, no one knew what it meant. Was it an enemy fleet, a new threat from the far reaches of space, or a natural phenomenon? But then the unthinkable happened. The signal grew stronger and clearer, not merely static in the background of the galaxy's constant hum, but a precise, calculated message. It was coming from the direction of a distant, unknown star system in the outermost rim, one that had been completely ignored by the Dominion until now. The first response from the Dominion was to send a reconnaissance fleet, led by Admiral Colin, one of the most seasoned and respected commanders in the Dominion's vast military. His fleet was composed of the finest ships in their arsenal, dreadnoughts and battle cruisers, each one a testament to Aldrich engineering. They expected a simple reconnaissance mission, a routine patrol, perhaps a brief encounter with a rogue asteroid, or maybe even some unknown space debris that had drifted from the outskirts of the galaxy. As Colin's fleet crossed into the edge of the star system, his crew began to notice something strange. An absence. There were no signals from other ships, no signs of civilization, no activity. The system appeared deserted, eerie in its silence. They pressed forward, their ships cutting through the void. Then suddenly, the sensors blared. Something massive was approaching. It appeared out of nowhere, dozens of ships, silent and enormous, appearing on the far edge of their sensors. They were shaped differently, not like the angular, towering ships of the Aldrich Dominion, but sleek, with sharp lines and jagged edges that looked almost alive. They moved with precision, coordinated and purposeful, closing in on Colin's fleet. The ships were massive, each one larger than any the Dominion had ever seen. And they weren't alone. More appeared from the darkness, surrounding the fleet in a seamless wave of steel and firepower. Colin stared at his screen, his face pale as he recognized the unmistakable signs. These weren't mere scouts. These ships were warships, a full battle fleet, and they were heading straight for the Aldrich forces. The Admiral's voice was steady as he issued the command to prepare for battle, but there was no panic in his words. Not yet. The Dominion fleet had never been beaten. And the humans, if they truly were the species responsible for the signal, would learn the harsh truth. There was no place in the galaxy for them. But as Colin issued orders to engage, one thought lingered in the back of his mind. How could anyone have kept this fleet hidden? And why did they come now, of all times? As the first shots were fired, the galaxy's balance was about to shift in ways no one could have predicted. The Aldrich fleet was a well-oiled machine, its warships designed for power and precision. Admiral Colin had commanded countless battles across the galaxy, and his crews had never once wavered in the face of danger. But as the human fleet closed in, he felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping into his mind. Uncertainty. The first volley from the human warships was like nothing Colin had ever seen. His fleet's shields flared up instantly, deflecting the initial barrage of energy blasts. But the intensity of the assault was overwhelming. The humans weren't just firing energy beams. They were launching projectiles that moved with terrifying speed, guided with an uncanny accuracy. The missiles were small but densely packed with explosive power, detonating on impact with devastating force. The shockwaves rippled through space, tearing through the Aldrith's front lines. Colin barked orders, and his ships retaliated. Their plasma cannons lit up the vastness of space, beams of destructive energy arcing toward the enemy. But to his horror, the human ships seemed to glide effortlessly, dodging every shot. They moved in strange, fluid patterns, no predictable movements, no traditional formations. They were unpredictable, as though the humans anticipated every counterattack before it even began. The first casualty for the Dominion came in the form of the Valoran, one of Colin's flagship dreadnoughts. A single missile from a human ship struck the massive vessel's shield generators. But rather than deflecting harmlessly off the shields, the missile cracked through them and pierced the hull. An explosion ripped through the ship's side, and the dreadnought shuddered violently as its interior systems sparked and failed. Within moments, the Valoran was nothing more than a hulk of twisted metal, drifting helplessly in space. Colin's heart pounded as he watched the horror unfold. His fleet was losing ships at an alarming rate. This wasn't the battle he had prepared for. The humans weren't following the typical rules of combat. There were no broadside exchanges, no straightforward slugfests. Instead, they wove in and out of the battle with surgical precision, isolating ships, attacking weak points, and always staying one step ahead. "They're outmaneuvering us, Admiral," shouted one of Colin's lieutenants, staring in disbelief at the chaotic dance of human ships on a holographic display. Colin didn't respond. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. His ships were faster, larger, and more heavily armed, but it was clear that the humans were using their superior tactics and speed to neutralize the Dominion's strength. It wasn't a battle of power, it was a battle of wits. He tightened his grip on his command console. "Send reinforcements, flank them from the left, and prepare to overload our main guns." But before he could finish, another series of explosions shook the fleet. A massive blast erupted near the Karen, a dreadnought to the right of the Admiral's flagship. The entire section of the ship was obliterated in a second. The Dominion fleet, once a force of unquestionable superiority, was rapidly descending into chaos. Then the unthinkable happened. A new wave of human ships arrived from the far side of the system, more, faster, more aggressive than before. Their numbers seemed to multiply out of nowhere, and they didn't just appear in random locations. The humans were coordinating, using their tactics to funnel the remaining Aldrith ships into traps. It was like they had a map of the battlefield, one that had been drawn long before the first shot had been fired. Colin's blood ran cold. His fleet was being systematically wiped out. His most seasoned commanders, some of the best warriors in the galaxy, were being picked off like targets in a shooting gallery. The Dominion had never faced an enemy like this, and suddenly, the truth dawned on him. This wasn't just an invasion. It was an execution. "Retreat. All ships. Retreat." Colin shouted into his communicator, his voice a mix of disbelief and desperation. But it was too late. The humans were already on top of them, cutting through the retreating fleet with brutal efficiency. No longer were the battles just isolated skirmishes. This was a massacre. As Colin's flagship turned to flee, one last missile streaked through the void, striking the aft engines of the Valkyries, his personal ship. The ship lurched violently, throwing the crew into a frenzy as sparks flew from the console. The flagship staggered and began to drift. Admiral Colin's face went pale. The Aldrith Dominion, once the unchallenged rulers of the galaxy, was falling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The humans were not here to negotiate. They were here to win. and they were already succeeding. The aftermath of the skirmish was a grim testament to the overwhelming power of humanity's fleet. The remnants of Colin's forces limped back to the Aldrith homeworld, leaving behind a trail of destroyed ships and shattered pride. The defeat was total, and the Dominion's military command was reeling. There was no question now. Humanity was a force to be reckoned with. But what did they want? What was their purpose in attacking the galaxy's greatest power? The answer came swiftly, and with chilling clarity. Within hours of the battle's conclusion, the galaxy's communication networks flickered to life. Across dozens of star systems, from the fractured Korath Federation to the mighty Trion Alliance, a single broadcast began to play on every screen, every console, every device. It was not encrypted, nor was it veiled in secrecy. It was a direct transmission, simple, clear, and commanding. The face of General Elara Graves, leader of humanity's war fleet, appeared on screens everywhere. Her expression was calm, composed, but the weight of her words hit like a hammer. This is humanity. We have arrived. The transmission was stark, with no flourish, no attempt to soften the message. Her voice rang with quiet authority, devoid of any trace of fear. The galaxy's leaders watched in stunned silence as Graves continued. We have been watching for some time. Your empires have flourished by the oppression of others. For centuries, you have built your power on the suffering of countless species. That ends now. You will no longer control the fate of the galaxy. The room in the Aldrith Command Center fell deathly silent as Colin, still battered from the retreat, watched the broadcast. His heart pounded, his mind reeling. The humans had not come as conquerors in the traditional sense. They were not seeking territory or wealth. They were seeking justice, a concept that had been alien to the galaxy's oppressors for millennia. As Elara Graves continued her message, her words resonated across the galaxy. We will not destroy what you have built, unless it stands in the way of freedom. We offer you a choice. Stand with us, or face the consequences of your actions. The old order is over. A new era is here. The broadcast ended abruptly, leaving a void that stretched across the galaxy, unanswered. There was no negotiation, no plea for understanding. The humans had laid their cards on the table. They had come not to negotiate for power, but to liberate the galaxy from its corrupt rulers. Across the galaxy, reactions varied. In the Korath Federation's council chambers, representatives exchanged nervous glances. The Korath had long been a neutral power, but their territory bordered the Aldriths, and they could not ignore this new threat. The Trion Alliance, a militaristic empire known for its ruthlessness, immediately dispatched messengers to their fleets, readying themselves for war. And in the distant reaches of space, systems previously under Aldrith control, now free from their grasp, began to stir, their inhabitants whispering about the humans and the promise of freedom. The Dominion, however, was in crisis. Colin, though a veteran of countless conflicts, had never faced an enemy like this. The humans were not only technologically superior, but they fought with a conviction that his people had long abandoned. The Aldrith had grown complacent in their dominance, ruling through fear and force. But humanity did not rely on fear. They relied on something far more dangerous, conviction, and the unyielding will to bring justice to the galaxy. Colin gathered his remaining officers in a dimly lit room aboard what was left of his flagship. We cannot stand idly by, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of defeat. This is no mere skirmish. Humanity has come to shatter everything we've built. We need to strike back, and we need to do it now. Prepare to rally the fleet. We will not let them destroy our empire. But as the orders were given, Colin couldn't shake the nagging doubt in the back of his mind. His fleet was broken. His forces were scattered. And as the Dominion's once unstoppable war machine struggled to regroup, he knew that the galaxy had changed forever. The Aldrith, for the first time in centuries, were not the hunters. They were the hunted. The galaxy's power balance had already begun to shift, and there was no turning back. Humanity had arrived, and they were not leaving until their message was heard. In the days following the broadcast, the galaxy's power structure was thrown into disarray. The Aldrich Dominion, once the epitome of military might and imperial control, was reeling from its humiliating defeat at the hands of the humans. The communication from General Elara Graves had sparked something deep within the galaxy's oppressed species. Hope. A spark that spread faster than anyone could have predicted. Across the star systems once subjugated by the Dominion, resistance movements began to take shape. Rebellions, which had long been crushed by the Aldrich's iron grip, started to gain traction. Freed slaves and former soldiers from the Dominion's conquered worlds organized under a single banner, the humans. They saw in them not invaders, but liberators, fighters for the justice they had never known. The galaxy's once timid populations now believed they had a chance. Even within the Dominion itself, whispers of rebellion began to stir. Resistance cells formed in secret, supported by defectors from every corner of the Aldrich Empire. And as these movements grew, so did the pressure on Colin and his remaining forces to react. The Admiral knew that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. They could not allow these uprisings to spread, nor could they risk facing the full might of humanity's forces once more. Meanwhile, General Graves and her fleet advanced across the galaxy like a sweeping storm, striking with precision, disabling entire planets' communications and military infrastructure before the local governments even realized what had happened. No longer did they face isolated skirmishes or hit-and-run tactics. The humans were now organizing full-scale campaigns, executing coordinated strikes against key military assets and empowering freedom fighters across the galaxy. Graves' fleet, which had once been seen as an unknown threat, was rapidly becoming the beacon of a new order. Every battle fought by the humans was another symbol of their resolve and efficiency. Their victories were swift, brutal, and decisive. They made it clear that they had no intention of being defeated, ever. In the Korth Federation, panic set in. The Federation had long remained neutral, avoiding the conflicts between the great empires. But as the human fleets tore through the Aldrich strongholds, and as more systems pledged allegiance to humanity's cause, the Korth knew they had no choice but to act. They had to either stand with the humans or face the prospect of falling to them. Their neutrality was no longer a viable option. High-ranking officials within the Federation scrambled to make contact with humanity, seeking to understand their true intentions. Were they conquerors, or were they something else, something more dangerous? Their political system was divided. Some feared what humanity's rise might mean for their own power. Others saw it as an opportunity to form an alliance, one that might save them from the crushing power of the Dominion. But the humans were no longer in the business of diplomacy, not after their overwhelming success. They moved with an unrelenting drive, giving those who resisted little time to make decisions. General Graves had made it clear in her message: join us, or face the consequences. The Trian Alliance, notorious for its militaristic nature, also began to prepare for a confrontation. They, too, saw the rising human threat as something too powerful to ignore. However, unlike the Korth, the Trian were not swayed by any notions of peaceful negotiation. They wanted to fight, to assert their dominance, and secure their place in the galaxy's new order. The humans were not interested in conquest. They had made that clear from the beginning. But their growing influence and the increasing number of systems that swore allegiance to them was beginning to disrupt the galaxy's delicate balance of power. The once fractured pieces of the galaxy were slowly starting to align, united under the banner of humanity's promise. Freedom from tyranny, a galaxy where power was not determined by force, but by the will of its people. The rising tide of rebellion was unstoppable. Even as Colin scrambled to regain control of his collapsing empire, the galaxy's power structure was beginning to shift beneath him. The more the Dominion tried to reassert its dominance, the more they found their forces stretched thin, unable to keep up with the growing strength of humanity's coalition. It was clear now. The old order was dead. And there was no stopping the inevitable rise of a new galaxy, A galaxy ruled not by empire and fear, but by those who had been oppressed and those who would fight for their freedom. Humanity had ignited the flame, and it was only a matter of time before the whole galaxy would burn with it. The galaxy had grown accustomed to the dominance of the Aldrich Dominion. For centuries, their warships had patrolled every system, and their generals had crushed any dissent with ruthless efficiency. Yet now, in the wake of humanity's arrival, their grip was slipping. The rebellion was spreading like wildfire, ignited by the brutal efficiency of the human war machine, and the Aldrich could feel the ground beneath them shifting. Admiral Colin was no longer the confident leader he had once been. The defeat at the hands of the humans had shattered his resolve, and every day that passed without reclaiming control felt like a step closer to his inevitable downfall. His fleet was in tatters, and his authority within the Dominion had been questioned by those who had once pledged their loyalty without question. In the heart of the Dominion's capital, an emergency council was convened. Colin was summoned to provide a report to the highest-ranking officials, a room full of cold, calculating faces who had once placed their faith entirely in him. Now, those same faces were filled with frustration and fear. "The humans have humiliated us, Admiral," said a high-ranking minister, her voice sharp and laced with venom. "We cannot afford to let this continue. You were the one who assured us that the Dominion's military might was invincible. Now look at us. We've lost systems. We've lost fleets. And the galaxy is slipping out of our control." Colin clenched his fists at his sides, trying to steady himself. "It is not over yet. We still have the majority of our fleet intact. The humans may have won a few skirmishes, but they are nothing more than a nuisance. We have not shown them our full power. If we strike back with everything we have—" "You've said this before," the minister interrupted. "We've sent wave after wave of ships, and yet the humans continue to advance. Your strategy has failed. We need new tactics, not the same stale approach." Colin felt the sting of her words, but he refused to back down. "We need time to regroup, to rethink our strategies. I know the humans are clever, but they are not invincible. They've made mistakes. They underestimate us. They don't understand what it means to challenge the Dominion." The council fell silent. Colin's words had been forceful, but deep down, he knew that the Aldrich were losing. They were being stretched thin by revolts in their occupied territories, by skirmishes with other galactic factions, and now by the unrelenting march of the humans. They were no longer the dominant force they had once been, and Colin was running out of time to restore that dominance. Meanwhile, General Ilara Graves continued her campaign without hesitation. She had no intention of letting the Dominion regain control. Every victory she claimed was not just a military success, but a message. Humanity was here to stay. They weren't interested in being conquerors. They were the embodiment of something far more dangerous: change. As Graves led her fleet into yet another system once held by the Aldrich, the planet below erupted in celebration. The inhabitants, who had long suffered under the Dominion's brutal rule, erupted with joy as the human forces landed. They had waited years for a chance like this, and now it was finally within their reach. Resistance fighters, once in hiding, now fought openly, and the Dominion's forces were quickly overwhelmed. With each victory, the human coalition grew stronger, recruiting more systems to their cause. Even the Korath Federation, long hesitant to commit to the conflict, began to make moves toward an alliance. Though still wary of the humans, they understood that siding with the Dominion now was a death sentence. The humans offered something no one else did: a promise of freedom. And that promise was more than enough to sway even the most skeptical governments. On the front lines, the Aldrich Dominion's commanders were beginning to panic. Reports came in daily of their fleets being outmaneuvered, their worlds slipping into rebellion, their soldiers abandoning their posts. The humans had a way of breaking their enemies, not with brute force alone, but with precision and psychological warfare. They didn't just destroy fleets, they shattered the will of their enemies. Colin knew that the time was running out. The once proud Dominion was on the brink of collapse, and there was no guarantee that even the full might of his forces could stop humanity's unstoppable march. The next battle was approaching, and this time, it would not be fought with guns or ships alone. It would be a battle for survival. And the Aldrich were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The weight of the galaxy's shifting tides was felt throughout the Aldrich Dominion. The once feared empire, built on centuries of domination and conquest, was now fractured, crumbling under the relentless pressure of humanity's rise. Admiral Colin, his mind consumed with a desperate need to regain control, had gathered what remained of his military elite for a final decisive campaign. This time, there would be no retreat. This time, there would be no mercy. The Dominion's remaining fleets were stretched thin, fighting off uprisings on multiple fronts, while the humans continued their unrelenting advance. Despite Colin's tactical genius, the war was no longer about strategies or firepower. It had become a battle of willpower, and the Aldrich were losing their edge. The galaxy no longer feared them. The human forces were bold, relentless, and fueled by something far stronger than ambition, a collective desire for justice. Colin stood before his commanders, the last remnants of his once mighty fleet. He was a man weighed down by failure, but he was not one to surrender easily. His voice was hard, commanding, yet tinged with the exhaustion of a man who knew his world was slipping away. "We will make our stand here," Colin declared, pointing to a holographic map of the star system. "This is our last chance. If we fall here, the Dominion is finished. If we win, we can still turn the tide. Our enemies may have numbers, but we have the experience, the firepower, and the resolve to crush them." His officers exchanged uncertain glances, but none dared to voice their doubts. They were the last of their kind, the remnants of an empire that had once ruled the stars. They knew this was their final battle, and the stakes were impossible to ignore. As Colin's forces gathered, the human fleet was already in motion. General Elara Graves had planned the next phase of the war with deadly precision. No longer just a series of tactical strikes, this would be a full-scale assault on the heart of the Aldrich Dominion's military apparatus. Graves understood that this battle would either bring the final victory or leave her forces vulnerable for the first time in months. But she had no fear. She knew what the future held, and it was one in which humanity would reign, not as conquerors, but as liberators. "Prepare the fleet," Graves ordered. "We will not give them the chance to regroup. We take this system, and we end their empire." The human forces descended upon the Dominion's stronghold with terrifying swiftness. The humans had learned from their earlier battles. Their tactics had evolved, their ships moved like shadows, and their weapons hit with unrelenting precision. Every movement, every strategy was calculated to ensure victory, and the Aldrich could not match their speed, nor their adaptability. As the battle raged across the stars, Colin's ships engaged in what could only be described as a desperate struggle for survival. The Aldrich forces fought fiercely, their plasma cannons blasting through the void, attempting to push back the human onslaught. But each strike felt hollow, as though the very will to fight had already left them. They were outmaneuvered, outclassed, and outnumbered. Humanity's fleet was everywhere, and it was relentless. On the command deck of Colin's flagship, the Valkyries, the tension was palpable. His crew moved with practiced urgency, but the confidence that had once defined them was gone, replaced by fear and desperation. Colin's once sturdy resolve began to falter, his mind grasping for any way out. "Admiral," one of his lieutenants called out, "we're being flanked on all sides. Our ships are falling." The news came as no surprise. Colin knew it was only a matter of time before their defenses collapsed. He could feel the weight of defeat pressing down on him, and his thoughts turned to the broader scope of the conflict. What had all this fighting been for? The human fleet had given no sign of wanting to rule the galaxy, only to free it from those who had. The idea of an empire built on oppression was crumbling before his very eyes, and he couldn't help but wonder, Was this humanity's way of showing that the era of the Aldrich was over? His eyes darkened as he turned to face his crew. Prepare for the final order. We will not surrender. We will fight until the last ship falls. But even as the words left his mouth, Colin knew deep down that it was too late. The Aldrich had been outmatched from the start. The galaxy had grown too vast for their control. And now, they were paying the price for a centuries-old arrogance that had blinded them to the rising tide of justice. As the human ships closed in, their weapons lighting up the darkness of space, Admiral Colin made one final decision. He would go down fighting, but he would also ensure that the human threat was never underestimated again. The battle that followed would be a brutal, blood-soaked affair, but it would ultimately be the final nail in the coffin for the Aldrich Dominion. The balance of power in the galaxy was about to change forever, and nothing would ever be the same again. The battle that raged in the heart of the Aldrich stronghold was a cacophony of fire and fury. The vastness of space seemed to tremble as the final confrontation unfolded. The Dominion's fleet, battered and exhausted, fought with the last remnants of their pride, but the human forces were overwhelming. Their tactics were surgical, their fleets moving with an almost unnatural precision. Every maneuver seemed designed not just to win, but to break the will of the enemy. General Elara Graves stood at the helm of the vanguard, watching as the holographic projections of the battle unfolded before her. The Aldrich fleet, despite their once mighty reputation, was crumbling before her eyes. Their ships, though still formidable, lacked the cohesion they had once possessed. One by one, they fell, their hulls crumpling under the barrage of human firepower. It was as though the will to fight had drained from them with each passing second. Graves' voice was calm but commanding as she issued the orders. Focus fire on their command ship. If we take down Colin's flagship, the rest of their fleet will collapse. We end this now. As the human ships closed in on the Valkyries, the flagship of Admiral Colin, the desperation of the Aldrich became painfully evident. Their counterattacks, though fierce, were increasingly uncoordinated. Ships that had once moved with purpose now drifted aimlessly, disoriented and disheartened. The sheer weight of the human onslaught seemed to drain the last reserves of their strength. Colin's flagship, the symbol of the Aldrich's unyielding might, was now a target, its shields flickering as it absorbed wave after wave of devastating fire. The once proud vessel seemed to groan under the strain, as if even it recognized that it was no longer invincible. Inside, the mood was frantic, as officers scrambled to keep their systems online, trying in vain to stave off the inevitable. "Admiral," a voice cried out from across the command deck. "The shields are failing. We're taking too much damage." Colin's face tightened. His hands gripped the edge of the command console. "Keep fighting. We can still turn this around. Reinforce the shields. Redirect power to the weapons." But deep down, Colin knew that his fleet was finished. The humans had outclassed them in every way imaginable. The Aldrich had once believed themselves to be the galaxy's supreme power, and yet here they were, teetering on the edge of annihilation. His mind raced, torn between fighting to the bitter end and the grim realization that his empire was collapsing. A loud alarm cut through his thoughts, and Colin turned to see the final blow coming. The vanguard had locked its weapons on the Valkyries, and in a flash of blinding light, the massive ship was engulfed in a devastating volley of concentrated fire. The shields that had once protected the flagship faltered and collapsed. The first hit took out the forward defenses, the second tore through the central command hub. The Valkyries was no longer a ship, it was a dying beast, writhing in the final moments of its existence. Colin's face, usually so stoic, contorted with rage and fear. He had known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. He had fought for the Aldrich's survival, and yet now, his failure would be etched in the history of the galaxy. As the Valkyries began to crumble, he turned to his officers. "Prepare to abandon ship," Colin ordered, his voice low but urgent. "Get to the escape pods. We cannot lose the fleet. The Dominion must survive, even if we do not. But as Colin made for the escape pod bay, a heavy, cold realization washed over him. It wasn't just the Valkyrus that was dying. It was the Dominion itself. The Aldrich had no future without their empire. And now that empire was being torn apart by humanity's unyielding drive for freedom. There was no escaping this. The galaxy was no longer theirs. Outside the Valkyrus, the battle was nearing its conclusion. The remaining Aldrich ships, now leaderless and scattered, were being picked off one by one. The human forces didn't relent. Their fire was swift, decisive, and without mercy. Within moments, the last of the Aldrich fleet fell, consumed by the might of humanity's unyielding resolve. As Colin's escape pod jettisoned from the wreckage of his flagship, he looked back at the scene of destruction. The Valkyrus, once the symbol of his power, was now nothing more than debris floating in the void of space. The Aldrich had lost. The Dominion had fallen, and humanity's victory was complete. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy began to feel the weight of the change. The human forces, not content with mere military victory, moved swiftly to consolidate their gains. The resistance movements that had once fought in the shadows now stood proudly in the light of the new order. The systems that had once cowered under the heel of the Dominion now pledged themselves to the humans, drawn by the promise of freedom and a galaxy where the strong did not oppress the weak. The Aldrich Dominion, the galaxy's greatest empire, was no more. And in its place, a new era had dawned. One led by humanity's vision of a galaxy governed not by fear and tyranny, but by justice, freedom, and equality. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted, and no one could deny that humanity had changed the galaxy forever. The galaxy, now irrevocably altered by humanity's triumph, was beginning to take shape under a new order. The dust of battle had settled, but the changes were only just beginning. Former Aldrich strongholds, now abandoned, were swiftly reclaimed and rebuilt under the watchful eyes of the human fleet. What had once been symbols of terror and oppression were being transformed into places of hope, commerce, and freedom. In the newly liberated systems, the people who had been crushed beneath the weight of the Aldrich Dominion were slowly finding their voices again. Resistance fighters, former slaves, and oppressed leaders began to shape the future. The human forces, led by General Elara Graves, not only offered military protection, but also worked tirelessly to establish governance, allowing the people to form their own futures. The promise of liberty had been fulfilled, but the work of rebuilding a galaxy was far from over. Graves, standing in the war room aboard the Vanguard, watched as the holographic displays showed the first stages of the galaxy's reconstruction. Alliances were being forged between liberated systems, and the once helpless planets now stood united. Even the Korith Federation, whose hesitation had once seemed like a death sentence, had begun to cautiously engage in talks with the humans. Her eyes lingered on a report about the Aldrich leadership. Admiral Colin had managed to escape the destruction of his flagship, but his fate was uncertain. Some said he had taken refuge on a remote world, hiding from the very empire he had once commanded. Others whispered of his plans to regroup with loyalists, but there was little hope that the Aldrich could ever rise again. The galaxy had learned a lesson. Tyranny could only rule for so long. But Graves knew that the fight was not entirely over. The human forces had toppled the Aldrich, but there were still factions in the galaxy that sought to claim power for themselves. The Trian Alliance, long the rival of the Dominion, had already begun to consolidate their strength. They feared what the rise of humanity meant for their own interests, and many in their ranks were not yet ready to accept the new order. Graves understood the delicate balance they now faced. The galaxy was in a state of flux, a state of transition. The old empires were falling, but that didn't mean the galaxy was unified under a single banner. The human-led coalition had brought peace to many, but there were still fractures in the system. The Trian, the Audrak Collective, and even smaller factions were biding their time. Unsure of what humanity's true intentions were, would they rise as conquerors, just as the Aldrich had done? Or would they prove themselves to be the liberators they promised to be? Graves stood tall, her eyes fixed on the stars. The future of the galaxy was uncertain, but humanity had proven something that no one had expected. They had proven that they could be more than just conquerors. They could be the vanguard of a new era, one where freedom and equality would replace oppression and fear. "The time to rebuild is now," she said to her team, her voice steady but filled with purpose. "We've won the war, but the true battle is ahead. We must build something better, something lasting. Our victory is not an end. It is the beginning of a new galaxy." As the human fleet continued its operations, the core principles of humanity's mission were clear: freedom, justice, and unity. But even as the promise of a new galaxy took shape, Graves knew that it would take more than military might to secure it. It would take diplomacy, trust, and the slow work of forging alliances between species who had long known only distrust. The first few years of rebuilding were difficult, and there were moments when humanity's resolve was tested. The Trian Alliance, sensing an opportunity, made several incursions into human-controlled space. Yet each time, the humans stood their ground, forceful, but never vengeful. They were building not just a military presence, but a reputation for fairness and equality. Slowly but surely, they earned the respect of even their most skeptical neighbors. In the years that followed, humanity's reputation spread beyond the borders of known space. They were no longer the mysterious newcomers who had shattered the galaxy's balance. They were becoming its new architects. New worlds, new alliances, and new partnerships flourished. Humanity's promise of freedom had resonated throughout the galaxy, and now it was becoming a reality. The Aldrich Dominion, though vanquished, had left a scar across the galaxy, a reminder that power built on fear would eventually be toppled. And the galaxy would never forget that it was humanity who had turned the tide, who had shattered the dominance of the old empires and created a future where no one would ever again have to live under the shadow of tyranny. As Graves watched the stars outside her command center, a thought echoed through her mind. The galaxy was vast, but humanity had proven something undeniable. When united under the banner of freedom, they were unstoppable. And this was just the beginning.